Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to participate in our Town Hall Tuesday meeting. This is our webinar to cover the same material we did in our recent Town Hall meetings about 2 weeks ago. We had great attendance at the meetings, but we wanted to make sure that we were providing as much outreach as we possibly can, talking about the deployment of NG9-1-1, focusing on the transition now from planning to implementation. So we've got a lot to cover this morning, and I want to make sure that we do provide time at the end of the webinar for questions. So what are we going to discuss today? The topics of discussion will be to spend just a few moments providing some background information on NG9-1-1, introducing you to the technology and why we are transitioning from legacy to NG9-1-1. Then we'll spend some time talking about how NG9-1-1 will be implemented. We'll focus on the means to overcome the transition costs. One of the primary means is to leverage the PSAP Grant Program. Specifically, I'll be focusing on the fiscal year 19 PSAP Grant Guidelines. Then Steve will take over, and he'll discuss the legislative changes that are associated with NG9-1-1 implementation, the financial impact of the legislative changes, as well as the other changes that we're proposing. And then at the end of the discussion, if anybody has any other topics or anything else that they would like to discuss, they're welcome to go ahead and jump in at that point in time. Also, anyone who would like to ask a question during the presentation is certainly welcome to do so. I suspect that if you're thinking of something and want to ask a question, there's somebody else participating on the webinar that may have a similar question. So you don't need to wait to the end. Just go ahead and unmute and jump in. Stop me. There's not a problem. You would interrupt my train of thought. So moving on to the introduction to NG9-1-1. I'd like to first focus on the challenges to the existing 911 system. The current 911 system in Virginia is struggling to continue to meet the demands of today, of our citizens. Unlike the old days, when there was a single telephone service provider, there are now dozens of providers and technologies that our citizens can choose from for telecommunications services. Almost every day, we hear about a new technology or application that's being announced that will allow people to communicate in ways that were never possible before. While telephones of the past were fixed to one location, wireless and internet technologies now allow people to take their devices anywhere in the nation or even the world and still have services. The companies that offer these services often do not have a local presence anymore either. So ultimately, it is the demands of the users for greater flexibility and mobility that are driving these new products and services, and will be driving how people communicate with each other and 911. And unfortunately, the current 911 system cannot keep pace with the advancements in telecommunications services. In fact, there isn't a single 911 network in Virginia. Rather, there are 9 independent networks that are not interconnected. 7 are provided by Verizon and 2 by CenturyLink. And these independent networks prevent the transfer of a call through the 911 network to another PSAP that is served by a different network. Instead, the PSAP needs to transfer the call on a 10-digit telephone line, losing any associated data about that call. If they need the alley information, they need to relay it by voice across the telephone. Even if the PSAPs are on the same network, the current network has a very limited ability to process data. The alley data stream associated with a 911 call can only contains 512 characters of data and currency that is all used to transmit the subscriber information, such as the name, address, telephone number, and other call data, such as longitude and latitude, telephone company name, etc. So All of that leads up to that last bulleted item on slide number 4, that the core analog technology is going away for many of those reasons that I mentioned. The carriers have moved away from analog technology. They're replacing their infrastructure with Internet protocol or IP infrastructure, and 911 needs to keep pace with that because that core analog technology is going away. So what is next generation 911? Well, the solution to overcoming the fact that the core analog network is going away is next generation 911. Commonly referred to as NG9-1-1, it is a shared Internet protocol network that uses packet switch technology rather than circuit switch technology. It is a complete upgrade of all existing network components, but in Virginia, this should not require the replacement of equipment in the PSAP. The PSAP Grant Program provides an avenue for localities to purchase equipment that is NG9-1-1 ready, and most jurisdictions have or are working towards acquiring equipment that is NG9-1-1 ready to the standards that are in place today. And I'll be talking more about this when we get into the PSAP Grant Program. NG9-1-1 will likely be a collection of networks rather than a single network, much like the Internet. But also like the Internet, it will need to be built to a set of standards to ensure seamless interoperability, not only within Virginia, but also with surrounding states. It must also be scalable and adaptable as requirements grow and change with new technological advancements. NG9-1-1 will enable public safety to keep pace with technology instead of lagging behind. I'm going to go ahead now and talk about the transition from NG9-1-1 planning to implementation, but I did want to stop and ask the participants on the webinar if anyone had any questions, any comments at this point in time. So hopefully one of the points that you take away from today's webinar is that the current analog 911 network is going away. And to address that very important issue, the 911 Services Board completed an NG911 feasibility study in 2015. And this was an extremely comprehensive study, and there was a series of town hall meetings in conjunction with the compilation of the material for the study, as well as another set of town hall meetings that talked about the requirements for the infrastructure to support NG9-1-1. And the IP network that is used in NG9-1-1 is called an Emergency Services IP network. People pronounce it differently. Some people call it an EasyNet, an ESINet, or an ESINet. But the acronym stands for the Emergency Services IP Network. So the 911 Services Board asked staff to complete this study. We worked with mission critical partners in this effort, and this study looked at NG9-1-1 from a technological standpoint, from an operational standpoint, how it would impact PSAP operations, from an economic standpoint, what was the cost associated with deploying NG9-1-1, and then also the policy, regulatory or political issues that needed to be addressed. So it was an extremely comprehensive document. There were about 150 recommendations included in this study. We have worked our way through about 2/3 of those. We've completed almost all of the planning requirements, and now the board and ISP staff has shifted from planning for NG9-1-1 to implementing NG9-1-1. And the real page turner occurred with the March board meeting. In this meeting, ISP staff presented the recommended changes. to support implementing NG9-1-1 along with a suggested legislative package, including legislative language. And the board approved the direction that staff was recommending, and as a result of that, it gave ISP staff the ability to start to socialize these changes and the legislation associated with that. So that's why we held those town hall meetings to talk about how we're going to implement NG9-1-1, and that's why we wanted to have this follow-up webinar today. For anyone who wasn't able to attend the in-person town hall meetings, we wanted to make sure that at least you had an opportunity to hear the same message that was conveyed during the town hall meetings. So with any planning effort, once you move forward from planning to implementing, the next question becomes, well, how much is all of this going to cost? And the price tag for NG9-1-1 transition is $69 million. And these costs can be broken down into three broad categories. The first category is ESInet setup. So this is the setup of the infrastructure, that IT backbone that I mentioned earlier. Another critical cost component is the preparation of NG9-1-1 GIS data. In the NG9-1-1 world, calls are not based on the MSAT. The MSAT goes away and calls in the NG9-1-1 world are geospatially routed. So GIS data becomes absolutely critical. So the preparation of data for call delivery is a very important component in NG9-1-1 planning and implementation. It's also a major cost category as well. So after setting up the infrastructure and after addressing the NG9-1-1 GIS data needs, then the next major cost category is transitioning the PSAPs from the selective routers to the ESInet. And you see here on this slide that I referenced the NG9-1-1 core services, emergency services, internet protocol network. We have identified the core services already, and these were developed during another series of town hall meetings. This was called transferability, faster call setup time, disaster recovery, and text to 911. So those are the functional elements that would be included in the network. I know many of you have heard about the multimedia features that can certainly come about with NG9-1-1, and that will come in the future. Right now, we're looking at a one-for-one replacement, replacing the current legacy analog network with an IP network that provides the core services that I just mentioned. So how are we going to pay for the $69 million in transition costs? And on this slide here, you'll see 5 items: the PSAP Grant Program, the billing agreements, the Network Improvement Fund, and the elimination of wireless cost recovery, and the elimination of tariffs. I'm going to spend some time talking about the first 4 items in terms of how these can be leveraged to support NG9-1-1 and how they can help offset the $69 million in transition costs. The elimination of the wireline tariffs can't really be considered in terms of what is available to the state to pay for this, because the wireline tariffs are paid for by the locality. So any savings that can be derived from the elimination of the tariff would be available to local governments to use to support NG9-1-1 reoccurring costs. So in this presentation, I'll be focusing mainly on those 4 bulleted items above the elimination of tariffs. I'm going to go ahead now and start talking about the PSAP grant guidelines for fiscal year 19. But before I do that, I did want to stop and ask participants if they had any questions or comments about what they've heard thus far. We have a number of people on the call. So again, if you're thinking about something, please feel free to jump in and ask that question or pose that comment, because if you're thinking about it, I'm sure somebody else is as well. Moving on to the 19 PSAP grant guidelines. How is the 19 guidelines going to be used to support the transition to NG9-1-1? And the 19 guidelines for fiscal year 19 in terms of the PSAP grant program represents a bridge year. So you will have components that still provide funding for legacy items as well as NG9-1-1 components. And that's because it is a bridge year, and we have some unique challenges that the PSAP Grant Committee and the board has asked staff to take a look at. But the grant program will be used almost exclusively to support one-time or non-reoccurring NG9-1-1 transition costs. And these are the same cost categories that you saw in conjunction with NG9-1-1, the one-time non-recurring ESI net setup, the cost of setting up that IP network, GIS data preparation, and then the selective router transition projects to NG9-1-1 core services ESI net. So the grant program would be used almost exclusively to support NG9-1-1, with the exception of the PSAP education program. Its acronym is PEP. There would still be $500,000 dedicated funding for this program. And the reason for this is technology and the operational impact of NG9-1-1 is going to require new skill sets among PSAP personnel. So 911 professionals need a way to continue to be educated, to have a means of gaining information related to NG9-1-1. GIS practitioners need to have exposure to NG9-1-1 as well. So we felt, we being ISP staff, the PSAP Grant Committee, and the board felt that the PSAP education program is extremely valuable in providing a means of local governments to educate their personnel to prepare for NG9-1-1. So funding will remain in the 19 guidelines for this program. So moving on to fiscal year 19, and the process for fiscal year 19, just like all previous grant application cycles, the application window will open July 1st. It will remain open for about 2.5 months, and then the applications are reviewed by ISP staff, then the PSAP Grant Committee, and then the applications would go to the board in January of 2018. And then the board would make award decisions, and funding would be available at the beginning of fiscal year 19, which is July 1st, 2018. The discussion thus far with the 19 guidelines has been to limit funding to the following priorities: call handling equipment, next generation 911 GIS, integrated CAD mapping solutions, and physical consolidation. There would not be funding for other items included in guidelines from previous years. So in the 18 guidelines, we narrowed the focus of the grant program to NG9-1-1, but there still were a number of legacy items that were funded. Right now, the only legacy item we have is integrated CAD and mapping. And as I've already mentioned, fiscal year 19 is a bridge year. The application cycle will open on July 1st, 2017. This was before any awards for a statewide ESINet RFP are made. Many of you are aware of the Northern Virginia ESINet RFP process. There should be an award for that process late spring, early summer. The resulting contract will allow other localities, even the state, to ride on that contract. So we have a decision to make whether to do a separate RFP or to utilize that existing contract from the Northern Virginia RFP process. So we're not going to have that decision until well after the 19 grant application cycle opens. So it would be difficult to tailor the guidelines specifically to the needs within that RFP. Another issue is the board will be making 19 grant awards in January 2018. This is before the outcome of the legislative agenda from the 2018 General Assembly session would be known. As a result, the 19 grant priorities cannot be dependent on the ESINet award or legislation. So we feel that the guidelines for 19 stand alone, that we will be making good financial decisions and investments regardless of what happens with a statewide ESINet RFP or the 2018 legislation. And I mentioned on the previous slide that we had the legacy item of CAD and integrated mapping solutions. And the reason that CAD is included is we've had a number of CAD solutions within local government becoming non-vendor supported. There's one particular vendor that this impacts about 40 some odd solutions in Virginia. And with CAD, my initial recommendation was that no, we shouldn't include CAD because we're focusing on NG9-1-1. This is outside of the scope for NG9-1-1 projects, but there was definitely pushback from the PSAP community and concern from the PSAP Grant Committee that may not be appropriate, given the number of localities that have had technically outdated applications submitted from the past 2 grant cycles and are expecting some type of funding when they become non-vendor supported. So for that reason, the CAD mapping integrated solution is included in the 19 guidelines. It is not at the same funding threshold as, say, call handling equipment, but there still is funding in the 19 guidelines for CAD replacements. So within the 19 guidelines, and this is all leading up to a new grant program, the NG9-1-1 grant program. And much of the information here I've touched on in previous slides. First and foremost, that many of the priorities that were previously funded by the PSAP grant program have been eliminated. It's the 19 guidelines focus on those 4 priority categories that I mentioned previously. Also, the concept of tiers that have been used in previous grant guidelines have been removed. The focus now is on replacing non-vendor supported equipment. Only non-vendor supported equipment is eligible for funding. The other tiers have been removed from the guidelines. Also, we will provide funding for physical consolidations and integrated CAD mapping solutions. The PSAP Deployment Assessments for NG9-1-1 will be another item that's included in the NG9-1-1 grant program. And this assessment is to help PSAP focus specifically on what the needs are for NG9-1-1 GIS. In the 18 guidelines, we narrowed the focus of GIS projects to 3 data components: address points, road center line, and PSAP boundaries. With the 19 guidelines, we're looking at GIS data prep. So additional work will need to occur in terms of having the board set up specific criteria and thresholds that will give PSAPs an understanding or an idea of where they have need and what funding may be available to them to address those needs. All of you went through the 2016 GIS assessments that were done last year, the MSAC-ALI GIS assessments, and those were very, very useful. Those analyses were very useful to give PSAP a snapshot of the quality of their GIS data for NG9-1-1. So we'll be utilizing those analyses. The board will be developing additional criteria and thresholds, and that will give you a sense of where you would fall for potential funding. So by criteria, it's setting up a specific need, and the match rate would be what you would be looking at in terms of where you fall. So if the threshold is set up at 98% and your PSAP is at 90%, then you do need some cleanup work. You do need some improvement in your data to close that gap. Somebody who's at 97, some not so much, and certainly somebody who has a match rate of 99% could not expect any funding. The outcome of that is if you've been proactive and you've been maintaining your data, you will probably receive less funding than your neighbors who haven't been as diligent. But the goal here is to make sure that we have statewide GIS data that meets a certain threshold to be able to proceed with NG9-1-1 implementation. And the timeline. One of the reasons, in addition to providing an opportunity for those who missed the town hall meetings to participate in the webinar, but also to make sure everybody knew when the decisions were going to be made with the 19 guidelines. So the PSAP Grant Committee will meet on April the 13th to review and vote on recommendations for the 19 guidelines. The guidelines have been posted to the ISP website. This is a draft document. If you have concerns, if you have questions, if you want to provide feedback, now is your opportunity to do so. If you've taken a look at them and you want to discuss them on today's webinar, that's fine. It's one of the reasons why we wanted to have this webinar. We're also going to be hosting a second webinar on April the 26th to talk about the outcome of the PSAP Grant Committee. So what recommendations they're moving forward with, were there any changes to the guidelines, to the draft document that's currently on the ISP website. So you have another opportunity from April the 26th before the board meets to review and vote on the guidelines at their May 11th meeting. So again, today was to talk about, to repeat the town hall meetings, but it also was to make sure that everybody understood that the 19 guidelines will be finalized at the May board meeting, but that there's still opportunities to provide comment and feedback on those prior to the May 11th meeting. And I've mentioned several times the PSAP education program. This program provides funding for 911 GIS-specific group education and training opportunities. There's $500,000 dedicated funding for the PEP program in the 19 guidelines. Localities have two options, and you can apply for both options to receive a PEP grant. $2,000 for an individual PSAP award, and then $3,000 for a multi-jurisdictional award. And again, a locality can participate in both an individual and a multi-jurisdictional PEP grant in the same grant cycle. So again, we felt very strongly that education is critical to being successful with NG9-1-1 implementation. So we wanted to make sure that local government had an opportunity to educate their personnel on NG9-1-1, as well as GIS and any issue that impacts the 911 ecosystem. So before I move on, or Steve moves on with the legislation discussion, wanted to stop again and ask if there are any questions. I've been talking for a while, and I know you all have been paying attention and thinking about all of this, and I'm sure there's some thoughts out there that somebody would like to share.
Yes, George, I have a question. This is Tom Rowland. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go ahead, Tom.
Real quick, my takeaway, though, was that the next generation features, such as text to 911, would still be part of the grant process. Is that correct?
They are. They're actually captured in the call handling equipment section. So if you take a look at the draft document in the definitions, you'll see it addressed in call handling equipment.
Super. That's my question. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Steve, I see that you're participating, so I can go ahead and hand it off to you. Or do you want me to just advance the slides?
Go ahead and advance the slide.
Okay.
So what we wanted to do is talk a little bit about the specific legislative changes that we're planning for next year. The reason we're starting so early is as one person who works the legislative environment said at one of the board meetings is if you don't have your ducks in a row by September, for anything you want to do legislatively, you might as well not even bother. So in order to make sure we have strong support or at least not strong opposition to the legislation that we're going to move forward with, we want to start talking about it now. I mean, ultimately, the board will not adopt the specific language until September, until their board meeting when they approve the annual report. But we want to start talking about it now. So I have had some people say, hey, do you want me to take this legislation to our legislators and start, promoting it? It's probably a little premature for that, but it is a good time to start sharing it with your county administration, city manager, whomever, to start talking about the changes that we want to make because this is significant. But to make sure we all start with the same kind of level set of how we got where we are, I wanted to talk a little bit about the history. Before 98, there was no legislation in 911. There was no requirement to do 911. There was really no mention of 911 in the Code of Virginia at all. In 98, the General Assembly did two things that was kind of interesting. One was they established the first 911 board. It was 7 members, 3 from local government and 3 from industry, and the chair was the comptroller. The issue was seen as a money issue. It was all about just distributing the 911 surcharge to the localities, and it really wasn't viewed as a technology issue much at all. They did that because the FCC had passed the order, the 94-102, that said localities or PSAPs could request location services, phase 1 and phase 2, from carriers, but they had to have a means of cost recovery for the carriers. So the implementation of the surcharge and creation of the board was designed to meet that requirement. They also, that same year, there were some localities that were saying, well, we don't want to take 911. At the time, the state police was taking it for most of the state, except for Northern Virginia and a few other small places. So as a result, they pushed for a study rather than passing the legislation with the surcharge and the board. And, interestingly, both passed. So the Crime Commission did a study from 98 to 2000. And during that study, they recognized that, there really was a technology component to the deployment of location technology, and there really needed to be some assistance to localities. So they created they recommended creation of the Public Safety Communications Division, originally in the Department of Technology Planning, now within VITA. They moved the board from a financial board to a technology board under the Secretary of Technology. They implemented a requirement to implement E9-1-1. At the time, July 1st of 2000, there were 37 localities that did not have E9-1-1. And then they established the cost recovery model for PSAPs and the carriers that basically said if you spend $1, you get $1 from the board. And at the time, the fund was flush with cash because we had been collecting the surcharge without a whole lot of outlay between 98 and 2000. So, at different points we had significant fund balances. Now, those first few years from 2000 to 2006, as I said, was a cost recovery model, which meant you had to submit invoices and show you incurred a cost in the deployment of wireless 911. Well, about 2006, I can actually take credit or blame for it. I noticed that we were given about the same amount of money to PSAPs every year. There was slight variation, but for the most part, everybody was getting the same money one year to the next. So I made the recommendation that we go from a cost recovery-based model to a formula-based model. And at the time, we were giving out about 45% of the fund was going to the localities. So I suggested, as a way of increasing funding localities, we increase that to 60% of the funding. And that way everybody would see an increase in funding. And in that first year, I think the lowest amount any locality got was about $45,000 for wireless 911 costs. Between 2006 and 2012, something happened that was not expected, and that was that, well, one of the things that several localities pushed for was a annual recalculation clause, and the thought was that some localities grow faster than others, so therefore it would be beneficial to every year recalculate that funding distribution formula so that faster growing localities would get more funding. What we didn't expect was how much faster some localities grew than others. And for generally speaking, few exceptions, generally speaking, the fastest growing localities were the largest, and they were growing so much faster than the smallest localities that there was a large shift in funding from 2006 to 2012 from the smallest localities to the larger localities, to the tune of that locality that initially was getting $45,000 a year was down to $32,000 a year. And the board established a funding committee to look at it, and they came back with recommendations. But before the board could implement the changes, something else happened in 2012, and that was the Governor's Reform Commission looked at the fact that all of the surcharge revenues collected by the Department of Taxation, they were sending that money to VITA, and VITA was turning around and sending it by formula, 60% of it out to the localities. So the suggestion was, or the recommendation of the Governor's Reform Commission was to go ahead and cut out the middleman and just have Department of Taxation do it. Well, Department of Taxation said, that's great, we're happy to do it, but we can't be recalculating every year. So through the legislative process, the decision was made that they would only recalculate once every 5 years, and that first time would be July 1st, 2017, or July 1st of this year. And they set the funding formula at the average, the pro rata average of what the locality received for the prior 5 years. Well, since it had been declining over 5 years, that locality that was at 45,000 that went down to 32,000, with the change in using the average of that over 5 years, they ended up going back up a little bit into the high 30,000s or so in the amount of funding, and that's where it's been set. That percentage or that formula has been set for the last 5 years. Next slide, Dorothy. So when you look at our current legislation, it breaks down into these 7 sections, and Section 12 is the definitions. That's where PSAP is defined. Next Gen 9-1-1 defined there. 13 is establishing the board. It makes up the membership. Now the membership is 16, with 8 still being from local government, 4 from the state, and 4 from industry. We did add a cable operator a year before last in the General Assembly. The 14 is what establishes the powers and duties of the board. That's where the annual report is required. That's where the planning role of the board is required. That's where the standard setting for Next Gen 9-1-1 is required. Section 15 is about the CMRS, or the Wireless Provider Subcommittee. We needed a separate subcommittee that was exempt from FOIA to review the carrier's funding submissions, since they do contain proprietary information. 16 is what requires you to do 911 and E911 and wireless 911. Section 17 is all the stuff about the funding. It lays out the collection of the surcharge by the carriers, the 60% to the PSAPs, 30% to the carriers, and 10% to the grant program. And then finally, if you didn't know it, there's actually part of our code section that requires the state police to provide Pound 77. Next slide. So in this past year, we went to the General Assembly and we recognized there was a problem. In preparation for this funding formula recalculation July 1st of 2017 that was required by code, Dorothy and Lewis ran the numbers based on all the true-up information you've provided over the last 5 years. And if the board was to implement the funding formula that existed before the legislative change in 2012, just the way we used to do it, and we were to apply that, the result was that trend of money shifting from the smallest to the largest continued. And that locality that started at 45,000 that went down to 32,000 is now down around 15,000, 15 to 17,000. And obviously we recognize that would be devastating to a number of small PSAPs. So especially, I mean, it was probably a year ago that we first ran those numbers, and maybe even a little longer than that ago, that we originally raised that concern about the shift in funding. But we recognized at this point local budgets are set. If we were to try and change the formula now, it would be extremely difficult for localities to prepare. So what we recommended to the board was shifting the recalculation by a year. Now, we had thought that we might come in with some more significant funding methodology change as a result of the need for next gen and these transition costs that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But once we started working on that and recognizing that Virginia legislation is modified much better by slow incremental change than major changes, we've decided not to make any significant changes to this part of the funding, which means we have to address this issue of the funding formula. But we need more time. We need to understand what the impact is. We need to make sure that the localities that are impacted have time to prepare and implement it. So what the board's done is in January, Dorothy asked them to establish a funding committee of 5 people, 2 PSAP representatives. 2 were chosen from the Regional Advisory Council, Jelena Young from Twin County and Steve McMurray from Fairfax County. 2 representatives, 1 each from VML and 1 from VACO. Interestingly, we did not ask them to focus on anyone with a public safety background, but VML has recommended Chief Wright from Chesapeake, and VACO has put forward the former police chief from Henrico, who's now, I believe, deputy or assistant county administrator, Doug Middleton. And Doug did run the PSAP back in the 90s for Henrico, so he does have experience with 911 and the issues that are facing us. The chair of that committee is Sheriff Hall from Allegheny County. Now, their first meeting is set for April 17th. Correct, Dorothy?
Yes, so from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m.
From 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. here at SESC. I would encourage you to get involved. Now, exactly what that committee will do and recommend, we do not know. It could be anything. It could be to change the legislation, to allow the board flexibility on the formula. It could be to take out the recalculation requirement and just leave the formula where it is. It could be to go ahead and implement the formula as it currently stands, basically a do-nothing approach. The do-nothing will result in a significant change in funding. But there is a school of thought, I'm not sure I agree with it, that says that if there is that kind of shift, that we should in fact embrace it, because at the end of the day, it's reflective of where the calls are actually coming from, and to artificially change the formula to increase funding to the smallest localities only encourages inefficient PSAPs to exist. Again, I'm not sure I agree with that argument, but it has been discussed by the board in the past of, do we continue to subsidize small PSAPs that might be primed for consolidation and would not providing additional funding encourage localities that might not otherwise look at consolidation to do so. So there is a school of thought for letting the formula go forward as it is. There's also the school of thought that says these PSAPs are established under local authority and therefore need to be supported fairly and equally by the board. So I don't, at the end of the day, VITA and the Integrated Services Program specifically do not have a dog in this fight. What we're talking about is how the pie of the 60% piece of the fund is distributed among the PSAPs. So it's really a local issue, and hopefully that committee will be able to do their work quickly and come back with some recommendations to the board in July. And if it requires legislative change, definitely by September, so that we can reflect that. Next slide, Dorothy. So what is the cost recovery in the code today? I mentioned the 60%. It's based on that pro rata of whatever you receive from 2007 to 2012. A lot of people say it's a 5-year. It's actually 6 if you count all those years. We produced this slide before the governor signed the legislation. He did sign the legislation. We did get the change from 17 to 18. So what's in red there is actually the law now. It is the requirement from code currently is it must be based on cost and call load data from the PSAPs for the previous 5 years. We've been collecting the true-up data, which is total wireless calls, total 911 calls, and personnel costs, which is salaries of call takers and dispatchers and one manager or director for the center, not including benefits and not including comp board. So we have been collecting that data, and what based on means is somewhat open to interpretation, but that is the requirement that's in code that we have today that we have to work with, and would need to be modified if that committee recommends something different. Next slide. Also within the code today, we have a 30% requirement. That is 30% of the fund is set aside for the carrier cost recovery. It's for direct costs. I will tell you that 30% of the fund is about $13, $14 million. Currently, the carriers come in for about 3 of that a year. So where does the rest of the money go? Well, $8 million of that goes to the compensation board, according to the Appropriation Act, for the cost of dispatchers and sheriff's offices. That was done as a budget balancing strategy several years back and has continued to this day. The remainder of the money, because there is a little bit left, $2 or $3 million, goes into the 10% fund, which goes into the PSAP Grant Program. That's why, though the 10% generates about $4 to $5 million a year, the reason we've been able to give out 6.5 last year, 8.5 the year before, 7.5 the year before that, is because of that carryover money from the carriers into the grant program. Now, the grant program is based on grant requests, so right now it has to be there has to be a request for the money, and the board has pretty broad authority for establishing the criteria for the grant. So everything Dorothy talked about with changes to the grant program actually does not require legislative change. The board has the ability to do that today without really any legislative change. Next slide. So what is it we're talking about doing? First, one of the big ways we want to pay for NextGen 9-1-1 is to eliminate carrier cost recovery, that $3 million or so a year that we give out to the wireless carriers, and that would involve removing that subcommittee that reviews those. We would also put in language to specifically prevent the carriers from being able to get 911 or to get paid for getting the call to the 911 network. Currently, we all pay Verizon or CenturyLink for these services, and we actually pay for two different services. One is for the 911 service provider cost. That's basically from the selective router forward. And once the call gets to the 911 switch, selective router, tandem, whatever you want to call it, the 911 trunks to get it to the PSAP, and then the ALI database and the MSAG and all of that. That's really the 911 service provider cost. That's not what we're talking about here. That part of it we will continue to pay until such point as we migrate to NextGen. And at the point we migrate to NextGen and some other vendor is providing those services, we stop paying Verizon and CenturyLink for that. There is also cost within what Verizon, CenturyLink, and any of the CLEC that have tariffs charge us for getting the call to the 911 network. That's for the trunking between the end office, the central office, and the selective router, and it's for the providing data to the ALI database, doing the MSAG validation, following up, and doing all the rest of that stuff. So that's the piece that this is intended to prohibit the carriers from receiving cost recovery for. It is because we're eliminating carrier cost, wireless carrier cost recovery, we believe it's the appropriate thing to do to level the playing field. And for the voice over IP carriers, they've never been eligible for cost recovery or any kind of payment for those costs. They are required by the FCC to deliver the call to the selective router with data at no cost to the PSAP anyway. So what we're really talking about doing here is leveling the playing field across the technologies at that lowest common denominator, which is no cost to us. And we really feel this is necessary as it relates to being able to fund NextGen 9-1-1's ongoing costs going forward. It also, our changes would establish that the board will establish the points of interconnection for the EZNet, and that the grants need to be focused on NG9-1-1. As Dorothy said, that's what we're really trying to do, so we want to go ahead and codify that. Next slide. So when you take all those things we want to do, the only two places that are really impacted with modification are Section 12 and Section 17. Section 15 actually just gets deleted. That's why it's in red. We wouldn't need that section at all moving forward. So what does it actually look like? Next slide. In Section 12, we'd remove some definitions that are no longer used. It's actually only 3. And then that 12.1 and 12.2 are two sections that got added to the code several years back by a well-meaning delegate. But basically all they say is voice over IP carriers, you need to do what the FCC tells you. And we don't really need to tell them that they have to do what the FCC tells them. They already have to do what the FCC tells them. So just as a housekeeping thing, we're getting rid of those. And then I mentioned Section 15 gets deleted. Next slide. For Section C of 17, whatever that funding committee that's been established, that 5-person funding committee would their results will be rolled in there. And then the meat of the changes is in Section D, where we remove the 30%. We actually, the way we do that is by increasing the grant funding from 10% to 40%, and then and then add the language of requiring that the grants support the development and sustainment of Next Gen 9-1. We had some concern from some people that might be limiting the future of the grant program after we pay the non-recurring costs of Next Gen. What do we do then? Will we have to go back and change the code again? I didn't believe so, but I will tell you just in the last 2 days, we had some conversations with our Attorney General contact, and he actually agrees we might be limiting too much. So that's some language that we probably will change in the review process here. And then we want to retain the cash reserve authority of the board. Next slide. In Section E, there's a audit requirement on the carriers. We would drop that, and then a Section F is added that would be where we sell the carriers that they can't receive any payment from the Commonwealth or the localities for the cost of getting the call to the point of interconnection. Basically, what we've learned is us providing that cost really leads to inefficient behaviors that some of the carriers have said that it's just really no significant cost to deliver the cost to a network anymore. By us providing cost recovery, in order to get cost recovery, they have to show those costs are direct, so they have to basically build a separate 911 infrastructure to process the calls, and as a result, that is more costly than if they would just integrate it with everything else that they have. So our providing cost recovery actually doesn't help us in this case. So all of this language here would be basically saying anybody who has to provide 911 must get the call to the point of interconnection at no cost to the Commonwealth or the locality. Now, it does put a requirement on the board to try and minimize that cost when we locate the points of interconnection, just to make sure that we have so that we're not incurring costs unnecessarily. When we learned that during one of our pilots, we had interim points of interconnection, and one of the local carriers would have had to pay over $3,000 a month just for 150 customers, and that just isn't efficient and wouldn't work out that well. So that's all we're talking about changing legislatively. Are there any questions or concerns? This will be a moving target. We are going to start working with sister organizations like VML, VACO, APCO, NENA, police chiefs, fire chiefs, sheriffs. We're meeting next week with the State Corporation Commission. We're meeting with the Attorney General's office to basically start socializing it and refining this. So this language that you see, and it's available on our website, will change. As an example, that Section F I just mentioned about the carriers not being able to charge for 911, we've already had the suggestion from one reviewer that be moved to a different section, to Section 16, because it really doesn't have anything to do with the fund, which is what Section 17 is about. It really has more to do with the provision of 911, which is what Section 16 is about. That's the type of feedback we need. So if you have any questions, concerns, comments, please feel free to reach out to me. If not, Dorothy, I actually have to deal with something else. You handle the financial impact part of the presentation? I know you've done it at the board meeting, so you should be able to do it without any problem.
No worries.
I turn it back to you.
Okay. Okay, moving on to financial impact. So this slide here is a template to look at the identified revenue sources. And when I mentioned the $69 million in deployment costs for NG9-1-1, I said that there would be a couple of ways for us to offset some of those expenses. The PSAP Grant Program, the billing agreement, the network improvement fund, and then the elimination of cost recovery. So because we're talking about eliminating cost recovery, you don't see it here in this template. But the next slide, when I advance it, will actually have the numbers. I just thought it would be easier to walk through the mechanics before we actually started talking about the numbers. So the NG9-1-1 deployment cost local state is the first line that you'll see across the top. We're looking at a 5-year deployment plan starting with 17, continuing to 21. And then 2 post-deployment years of 22 and 23. And the reason that those are included in there is because we're looking at borrowing against the Treasury or from the Treasury to help overcome the funding gap. And yes, we do have a funding gap. So the billing agreement, the grant program, and the network improvement fund are looking at ways of offsetting the one-time deployment costs and then eventually paying down those one-time costs. We also have, as I said, the desire to borrow from the Treasury. So looking at the same slide with actual numbers, you'll see across the top the deployment costs in red, and then the ways to go about offsetting those costs down below. The elimination of cost recovery is included in this slide here, but you'll notice if you come down to the last line, funding gap, that we remain in the red for the majority of the deployment, 5-year deployment process. And we are still in the red during the first year of post-deployment, 2022. We don't actually have a positive cash flow to year 2023. It would be extremely difficult to try to deploy NG9-1-1 with a negative cash flow in 4 of the 5 deployment years. So you'll see on the next slide a very similar depiction here of what we had before, but this slide or this template here actually shows that the state Treasury funding has been added, and the outcome of that you can see in the last line. It turns the deployment cost from a negative to a positive in 2019, and it stays that way throughout the deployment process and then into 2 years of post-deployment. Now, borrowing from the state Treasury wouldn't simply be a transfer of $30 million beginning in year 19. It would be borrowing to cover cash needs to keep us having funding available when the PSAP need the funding. So this is just the actual numbers into that same template that I showed you in the previous slide. The billing agreements you can see as it's being absorbed into the PSAP Grant Program, the Network Improvement Fund, and this is the $1 million that is a line item in the PSC budget. It can be used for network improvements. It was used to fund the feasibility study, the comprehensive plan, and most recently the ECAP implementation. So again, the funding for network improvements would be rolled into the grant program, and it does give the appearance, if you look at that PSAP Grant Program line, that we're going to have a windfall and be very flush with cash for the PSAP Grant Program. Again, during the deployment process, the focus of the grant program is going to be almost exclusively on NG9-1-1. So what you saw in the 19 guidelines, CAD and mapping would only be available in fiscal year 19. That would move out of the grant program in 20 and subsequent years. Now, once we're beyond NG9-1-1, then we can look at what the 911 ecosystem would need in a steady state environment. So I would anticipate there being significant changes to the grant program once we're at post-deployment. But the end result is to have a positive cash flow during the deployment process. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. And if anyone has any questions, any feedback, anything else that they would like to talk about, now's your time to do so.
Dorothy, this is Erin Elrod.
Yes, Erin.
I have a question. It was asked about the text to 911 and whether or not that was still going to be handled in the grant, and you said it was going to be handled under the call handling equipment. Is that only if you're purchasing it new?
For call handling equipment, yes.
Okay, so if you already have your call handling equipment, you can't upgrade if you don't have the text to 911.
You would be upgrading if it is for an NG9-1-1 ready function. So if you're upgrading for text to 911, yes, it would be included.
So you would not be able to put in for a grant?
You would be able to put in for a grant for call handling equipment, $150,000 for an individual PSAP or $200,000 for a multi-jurisdictional or shared services project. Now, within that, the criteria is to be NG9-1-1 ready. Since we have identified text to 911 as a core service for NG9-1-1, if you're looking to replace something to support NG9-1-1 in conjunction with the call handling equipment, it would be fundable.
Okay. Thanks.
Dorothy,
somebody else? Go ahead, Chris.
Question. If we've already transitioned our services over to IP-based through West, where would that put us in this scenario? I mean, we're providing 911's provided IP now, so.
Whatever we do from a statewide level has to provide connectivity for 119 primary PSAPs. With the Northern Virginia project, Loudoun has already deployed the West solution. They're still participating in that ESI-NET project because there needs to be information or data exchange with the Northern Virginia project. So just because you've made the transition doesn't mean that we're going to set you aside and you're an island, you're on your own. We have to figure out a way to make sure that your PSAP, as well as anybody else in a similar situation, can exchange data and be part of the statewide ESI-NET.
Okay. I was just curious. We have a long contract, so it's going to run into many of these periods. So.
Right, and how we go about doing that, I don't have the answer. That's where we would need that trusted partner, the vendor, our vendor partner on board. They would need to provide us advice on how we would handle that. And one of our guiding principles is to do no harm.
Okay. All right, appreciate it.
Any other questions? Any additional feedback? Anything else for discussion?
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I do have a question. It's not really related to the next gen, but since it says other topics, are there any guidelines for PBX setup or dialing 911?
I would think that the NINA website would be able to provide you information on that. But if you send me a separate email, I'll make sure that we provide some direction to you.
Okay, very good.
Dorothy?
Yes.
It's Bruce Edwards in Franklin. When will the locality cost estimates be available? At what point in this will we be able to know, we're going to be paying a lot more, a little bit more, a little bit less than what we're paying now for the services that we have?
That's going to be a twofold process. One of the things that I'm looking at now is I mentioned the elimination of wireline tariffs, and one of the things that we wanted to make sure is that, and the reason why we did the PSAP budget survey was to validate critical infrastructure, in particular what localities are paying on the wireline side, because we wanted to make sure that the number that we estimated in terms of cash flow back to the localities was accurate, and that was an accurate number for planning purposes. Now, the second part of that is for me to use the results of the early adopters to see what their reoccurring costs are, both from the statewide perspective and then from the PSAP perspective. So what we have, what our hypothesis is that we are estimating, or our assumption is that the localities will have the same or less reoccurring costs with NG9-1-1 that they do in the legacy environment. I will not have an answer to that until I have responses back from those 6 early adopters. Now, that would also be further refined once we have a vendor on board, because there could be additional costs that we're not aware of at this point in time, but certainly the whole implementation process would be transparent.
Okay. Now, when you say have a vendor on board, what's the target date for that?
I don't have a target date to have a vendor on board. What I can tell you is that we're looking at late summer, actually late spring, early summer for the Northern Virginia decision out of their RFP process. And then we will take a look at that award and see if it makes sense for us to ride on that contract from a cost savings perspective and a requirements perspective. Are we getting everything that we need, and are we getting it for the least possible amount? Or should we do an RFP? And that decision would happen soon after the Northern Virginia award. If we're looking at an RFP process, I would suspect that we're looking at 6 to 9 months to complete that RFP process. So that would take us into the spring of 2018.
Okay, and my last question, have these same presentations been pushed out to VML, VACO, and those organizations? I know you said they were on one of your committees, but just be interested to know if it's being pushed from that perspective as well.
I haven't sent them specifically to VML and VACO. I know we had a number of local government participants with the ISP town hall meetings, but certainly we will be sharing this information with VML and VACO as we socialize the legislation. I certainly can incorporate a presentation on NG9-1-1 with the funding committee, since we will have VML and VACO. I mean, the context of the funding discussion that they're having definitely relates to the NG9-1-1 implementation.
Okay. So I guess my takeaway is I need to just tell my folks change is coming. They need to prepare, be ready for it.
Exactly. And as soon as we have information, we're going to be sharing it with our local government constituents. You can expect more webinars. You can expect more meetings. I know we have a lot on our plates, and I know that everybody is stretched fairly thin in terms of available time. But if anybody has a better idea of how we can get the information out, please share that. But you're right, Bruce. Change is coming, and we will try to keep you as informed as we can to the best of our ability.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else?
Dorothy, one more question. This is Tom Nolan again. One of the meetings I understood that Northern Virginia is going to be doing it hopefully first. And from that region, what region do you hope to tackle next, moving the routers off of to the IP as we?
I really don't know. There was a queuing order that was proposed in the NG9-1-1 deployment model. I can certainly, share that information with you. It was looking at deploying all of the Verizon selective, or deploying NG9-1-1 within the regions that were serviced by Verizon, leaving CenturyLink as the last deployment. But our vendor may have a different suggestion or a different queuing order that makes sense. So again, we're not going to have that information until we have a vendor partner.
Gotcha. Got it.
Any other questions or feedback on NG9-1-1 or another 911 topic? Well, thank you, everyone, for your time this afternoon. We wanted to make sure that we had ample time, but we are able to give you 15 minutes back for your day. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. Take care.